All right, 450 from Paddington is the next Marple in the series that I've been reading and or listening to. This one has taken me a while to get through, not because I haven't enjoyed it, but because it's just a little bit, it's been broken up through some travel and some stuff that I had, and I wanted to make sure I gave it its fair attention because it seemed fairly promising. It is like many of the other Marple novels, a bit longer than your average Hercule Poirot novel, which personally is not my typical preference for these stories, but it works maybe a little bit better in this one than some because there actually is more stuff going on to justify the length. So it's not just more basically just talking about more and more characters, which is sometimes what it turns out to be. So the way this one starts is really compelling, and that was one of the first things about it that got me hooked when I started. I had somewhat of a favorable hope even just going into this one. I'm not sure if this is really a beloved one or if I just maybe thought that it was a beloved one, but I was at the very least familiar with the title long ago, and the title itself suggests we're going to have another one of these famous train mysteries like Murder on the Orient Express, Mystery of the Blue Train, but you find before long that unfortunately this is not really going to be the case. There's this interesting and sensational premise of seeing a murder through the window of one train as it passes another at the point where they're both going at roughly the same speed, so you can see through from one to the other. But the mystery of the 450 train from Paddington is a mystery that Marple, in a bit of her own sleuthing, clears up herself pretty much in the first quarter of the book or so. Which also is another point in the novel's favor, that Marple gets involved pretty quickly and is quite active. Although the beginning of the novel is where we see the most of Marple before she gradually fades a little bit more into the background. But still, this isn't the moving finger where she's like not even there until like 3/4 of the way through. Now, the next part of the novel, which involves Marple's sort of appointed proxy, Lucy Islesborough, going and trying to track down the body, was for me a little bit slower. Not quite as promising as how things had appeared from the start. And unfortunately, I have to say that this figurative train really runs out of steam at that point because the novel, while interesting in some regards, is not that interesting, not that suspenseful, and honestly just not that solvable, even if you can maybe use your knowledge of Christie to guess who the culprit or culprits might be. Similarly, the characters in this novel are, I'd say, middle of the road, frankly not major standouts, but we have seen worse though. Lucy Islesborough, the live-in fixer type nanny or housemaid or whatever her role is, she takes on sort of a pseudo-protagonist role as she steps in as an active proxy for Miss Marple on the site where the murderer is expected to be residing. She's potentially intriguing when the novel, she's potentially intriguing when she's introduced, but as the novel progresses, she's no Lynn Marchmont or even a Jane Plenderleith. She's all right, but wasn't one of Christie's like top most standout characters for me. The other characters too, with their Anglo-Saxon royalty names, Emma, Alfred, Cedric, are a bit of a mixed bag. Interesting enough to make for a decent story, but not really the most memorable at the end of the day. But then there's also Brian, a former Air Force pilot and the husband of the family's deceased daughter, Edith. And also there's his precocious son, Alexander, who the two of them together, for me, actually are one of the most memorable duos within the entirety of Agatha Christie's works. The two of them have this amusing father-son dynamic in which essentially we get the impression that it's Alexander who has to look out for his dad rather than the other way around. His dad, Brian, is kind of a lost soul since he's returned from the war. He used to be an Air Force pilot. So the father-son dynamic is somewhat inverted in this novel. A funny little quirk about the characters I noticed is that the characters and essentially the suspects have names starting with A, B, C, E, no D, I guess, but it feels a little bit like a list of take your pick, multiple choice. I guess there's one character you could, by a stretch, make the D, but that's a little bit of a stretch. Of course, there's also Harold Krakenthorpe, who doesn't fit that mold exactly, and Luther Krakenthorpe, the idle and loves to complain patriarch of the family, who is not exactly the most enterprising and likes to sit and be taken care of and gripe about his kids. So then also, there are I mentioned Alexander. So then also there are the kids. I mentioned Alexander already, but he also has a friend, James Studdert West. Some of the most fun parts of the novel for me, just in terms of like enjoyable to read and charming, are these kids sort of snooping around, trying to figure stuff out, and just generally being very clever kids, which is not that strange. Kids can be pretty clever. I think they may have actually been a little bit older than what I imagined them to be in the novel. Like, I sort of imagined them as preteens, while I think they might be like actually in their late teens. But yeah, I feel like this novel's development kind of comes in bursts where you have these exciting reveals and then it gets kind of dull for a while, or there's not as much action. I guess some of that is sort of by design, in a way that could be relevant to the mystery. Like, something seems important and then it's not important, but then it comes back, and you have to figure out which things are actually important, since many of them are fading or reemerging into the foreground. And then you're never sure which clues are going to stick by the end or not, because there are so many ideas here and there, and too many for all of them to be true. So together, they represent the most likely set of possibilities, and one of them, will turn out to be correct by the end. Except not really. So to elaborate on that more, I'm going to have to get into the spoiler section, but I enjoyed it to an extent, but it wasn't one of my favorites among the Marple mysteries. I just thought the mystery itself was not that great, and the rest of it wasn't enough to make up for it. So yeah, that's how I come down on 450 from Paddington. But to say more, I'll have to get into the spoilers, so I'll give you a few seconds to escape if you still want to catch the 450 train. So there are a few zingers for us at the end of this novel. As I approach the end of the story, I can't really say I had much of an idea for the motive. Unfortunately, this turns out to be something I'm kind of just fine with, because there isn't really much in the way of determining a motive here other than just kind of guessing. And that, of course, makes it rather difficult to pin down the perpetrator. I mean, then again, even if greater pieces of the puzzle are rather unclear, one clear potential motive seems to be financial gain, but that doesn't really help us much either, because any of the suspects stand to gain financially here, including the doctor, who appears likely to marry Emma Krakenthorpe in the near future. And this as a motive is a little bit shaky, because the obvious person who needs to die for the children to inherit is Luther Krakenthorpe. Killing one of the siblings, even a long-lost wife of the long-deceased son of Luther Krakenthorpe, Edmund, would only increase the portion of the pie given to each sibling when Luther Krakenthorpe does eventually die. In short, there's all this suggestion of who is about to be murdered and who is really supposed to be murdered, like what was intentional and what was unintentional, and it's pretty hard to puzzle out what the actual truth is. Like, I could not, by the end of the book, really figure out whether Luther, until the final reveal, I couldn't tell whether Luther Krakenthorpe was actually intended to be killed or not, partly because the murderer seems to have been trying to do him in at the end, and then he rallies and survives because, against all odds, he's actually a stronger man in terms of constitution than he thinks he is. Now, I mentioned that the trying to kill off all the siblings to get a bigger piece of the pie doesn't seem that plausible as a motive, but in conjunction with also killing Luther Krakenthorpe, this is exactly what the killer is trying to do somewhat systematically, which really does make things more confusing and hard to guess. Now, does that actually reveal the motive for killing this random unidentified woman at the start of the novel? Not in the least, although you might be able to start making some shots in the dark and maybe even guess as to whom she might be, since it is a flavor of solution that we've seen before in Christie. So I considered each of the siblings in turn as suspects, most seriously Emma, and least seriously Brian, who doesn't really seem capable of executing this sort of a plan. I was pretty confident, though, by the end of the novel that the killer was Dr. Quimper, which is correct, although the rationale for committing the murder that began the whole story was beyond me and is really hard to guess. All I knew was that, much like some other recent Marple novels I'd read, the person who seems to be running the show and has control over a lot of the evidence, particularly in the later parts of the novel, has the opportunity and all that, he turns out to be the killer. Of course, the clues towards all this turn out to be pretty jumbled because, unlike some novels where you might be clever enough to successfully distinguish the true clues from the red herrings, in this novel, to the very end, many clues could equally well be red herrings, and we really just have no way of knowing. Is Luther Crackenthorpe actually being poisoned, given that he never actually dies, or is he basically just imagining it, which seems realistic? Is Martine, the long-lost sister-in-law who wrote this letter to the family, actually a person or a scammer of some sorts? Or is she someone fabricated by some member of the family who wrote this letter? No, she turns out to be the mom of Alexander's friend James Stoddard West, which we learn in a last-minute reveal that no one asked for and is really dumb. It just wasn't necessary. It does help clear some things up in this hopelessly convoluted murder with not very many concrete clues, so maybe we needed it from an investigation perspective to rule out one of the possible explanations, but yeah, it's not great. Having Dr. Quimper as the murderer is also arguably a bit of a weakness for seasoned readers because, well, why is it that I was able to guess him even though the motive and the evidence were all over the place? It's because at this point in the Christie novels, we've learned that when there's a suspect that isn't taken seriously as a suspect, and I'm not sure that anyone ever even mentions Dr. Quimper as a possible suspect, like, it's one thing if that person really is someone who no one would consider, but Dr. Quimper is there all the time. Has close ties with the family. The fact that no one mentions him means that you have to pay close attention to him. And yeah, in this case, it does end up being Dr. Quimper. I remained unsure to the end whether Emma might be in on the plan too, although by later in the novel, I was leaning towards thinking that she was probably unaware of the whole thing, more just by kind of context clues than by, concrete deductions. Overall, the mystery is one that I found intriguing and pretty fun to follow. Not my favorite by any means, even from the start, but it fizzles out considerably over the course of the book, as it turns out by the end to feel jumbled and just a little disappointing, with a reveal and motive that aren't very satisfying in their explanation. All in all, given my somewhat high hopes for the book, I was unfortunately pretty disappointed. I'd probably place this one just short of the top half of Agatha Christie's novels overall, maybe somewhere around the middle, but probably a little below. Mostly enjoyable still, but also somewhat frustrating. And that's a wrap for 450 from Paddington. I'll see you soon for the next one, and happy reading.